So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Good Measure today. My name is David and I'll be your host. Today, we have one of the world's leading experts on the social impacts of video game monetization and lecturer for the University of York Computer Science, Dr. David Zendle. He is here today to talk with us about loot boxes, problem gambling, and the works. Dr. Zendle, thank you for being here with us today. Do you mind quickly introducing yourself to those in the audience who may not be familiar with your work?
No, not at all. And thank you very much for having me here. So my name's Dr. David Zendle. I'm a lecturer in computer science at the University of York. And as you said, I'm considered one of the world's leading experts when it comes to how video games are sold and the convergence of gambling and video games in specific. So back in 2018, I noticed that there wasn't any empirical literature about loot boxes. People seem to be talking about them a lot and worrying about them a lot, but there wasn't like a single scientific study in the literature that went out and found out anything about who was spending money on them, why they were spending money on them, or what that might be doing to them. So I was kind of there at the birth of this literature on the effects and consequences of how video games are sold. I've kind of moved with that for the last few years.
And so it's been almost 3 years since your first cited article on the issue. And what has kept you going on this issue, and why is this such a big one?
I think the thing that's kept me going is the more we find out about loot boxes, the more their potential impact on society seems bigger, right? So I did my PhD on violence in video games, right? And like violence leading to people being violent and stuff like that. When you do research on a topic like that, you find nothing, right? So I spent like 4 years of my life running studies and finding nothing. So I run a study which the literature would show a clear link between violence and videos. I get nothing. I tweak it, I'd run it again, I get nothing. And eventually, when I published my doctorate, it was just a series of studies where I said, like, look, if violence in video games works the way people think it works, then I should have seen something. And I just spent 4 years seeing nothing, tens of thousands of people going through my lab, nothing.
Yeah.
And the shocking thing for me with loot boxes is that every single time I run a study, I see something. Like, it's clear as a bell. It's every single time. So one thing that keeps me going is the fact that the results you find in this field just paint such a clear picture. And the second thing that keeps me going is that almost nothing was known in 2018, right? So this is year 3 of a field of research. You can consider it the field of sort of monetization studies or something. And like, we're right at the beginning. We're like, if it's, genetics or something, we're like hundreds of years ago, right at the ground floor, able to find out everything's to play for in terms of discovering the world. And that's really exciting for scientists. And I guess if there was one more reason, it's that it matters, right? So when we talk about loot boxes, when we talk about social casinos, when we talk about predatory monetization, we're talking about stuff that has real repercussions for people. So whether it's this idea that loot boxes might be a gateway to gambling, or it's simply the idea that they're just a massive rip-off and they're just taking a bunch of money off people whose lives are therefore impoverished, in all cases, it matters. So like, there are 3 things that have kept me going, I guess.
And so in your research, there has been a lot about loot boxes and how it affects problem gambling. Has there been any research done on how social media and influencers on the market influence the use of loot boxes and how it may correlate to problem gambling?
Oh man, I wish there had been. So this is such a cool topic. So 3 years ago, we had no literature on loot boxes, right? So I did a study in 2019 or something where we tracked the uptake of loot boxes. And we saw that like kind of by 2015, the majority of play sessions on desktop took place in a game that had loot boxes in. Yet it's not until 2018 that academics start to write papers where they interview people or survey people about loot boxes. So you've got this huge lag between a tech phenomenon in the real world and academia noticing that it should study it. And this is a huge problem. And it's a huge problem for the influencer stuff you're talking about now, because like influencer videos of people opening loot boxes have been around for a while, right? But they're super poorly understood. Like there's almost no research out there that addresses why people would watch these videos or what watching these videos would do to people. So we know that watching loot box. So I did a piece of research on this, which from there's not very much out there. There's a publication I've written on this topic where we took, it was about 1,000 people, and we measured the extent to which they were watching these videos, and we also gave them a screener for gambling problems. And it turns out that these things correlate. So if you're watching loot box opening videos, you're more likely to have problems with gambling than someone who isn't watching loot box opening videos. As with all the correlations in the loot box literature, though, we don't know why there's a correlation. We don't know if it's because people who are really super into gambling later go on and engage with this loot box stuff, or if it's the loot boxes that are driving later engagement with gambling. There's no way to tell.
And so what are the most dangerous implications of loot boxes and problem gambling? What kind of things should the audience be wary about before making a microtransaction and going forth?
That's also a good question. So problem gambling is a engagement with gambling services and products that is excessive, typically outside of the gambler's volitional control, and linked to major problems in an individual's life. So it's linked to financial distress, but it's also linked to bankruptcy. It's linked to anxiety, it's linked to depression, and most importantly, it's linked to morbidity. People with gambling problems die, and often they take their own lives. It's really, really terrible, and disordered gambling is recognized within diagnostic manuals as being a genuine medical condition, an addiction akin to an addiction to a substance like an opiate. Very, very serious stuff. So if loot boxes drive that relationship, if engaging with loot boxes, there's a pathway where you can propose that people engage with loot boxes and they get used to sort of the buzz and the thrill of the loot boxes, and then they go out into the real world and they see something that's formally very similar to a loot box in terms of like a slot machine or something, and they engage with that, and then a proportion of those people will develop gambling problems because of that engagement. So if that's what's going on in the world, then loot boxes could have quite serious public health effects. Problem gambling it's awful. It's really dreadful. So there's one potential effect out there that's really bad, but there's also another one. So all we have in the literature at the moment is a bunch of correlations. We know reliably, robustly, pretty much every time you measure it, that people who tend to spend more money on loot boxes tend to also be more likely to have gambling problems. But we don't know if it's because of this gateway where spending on loot boxes causes gambling problems, or another relationship where maybe you're already super impulsive, and so therefore you're gambling, but you're also likely to do other things that are driven by your impulsiveness, like spend money on loot boxes. So we don't really know what's going on here. It's like two doors, right? And if we open door A, it's terrible. But if we open door B, it's more questionable how bad the damage is. And depending on your politics, your opinion will vary about what governments should do to solve this, if anything. Like, if it's just the case that these appeal to people who are very impulsive, there's a school of thought which says no regulation should occur. Whereas it's much harder to make that case if it turns out that they're literally driving gambling problems.
And so speaking about regulation, in the last few years, there has been an increase in the amount of politicians and legislature that has been directed towards this issue. How do you think that this will affect loot boxes and microtransactions and the public's perception of them?
That's really interesting. So let's think who's done it really strongly. So when it comes to public perception, this is the easier one to answer, because like people's parents didn't know about loot boxes like 5 years ago, right? So I remember when I started my work on loot boxes, nobody had any clue what the heck they were except the gamers. Whereas now, I could talk to my parents' friends about loot boxes and they know what they are. They're like, oh, your loot boxes research, really interesting, David. And they've heard about it in the newspaper or something. And the reason why they've heard about it is because of the regulation. So particularly in the UK, we had a bunch of sort of high profile regulatory legislative procedures to do with something called select committees, where you sort of get a bunch of experts in to talk to members of parliament about an issue. And because those were so high profile, loot boxes kind of got raised in the public consciousness as something that exists, and not in a good way. So all this regulation, whether you're in the USA, where you're having the Federal Trade Commission workshop, whether you're in Australia, where you're doing something with your Senate, whether you're in Belgium or the Netherlands, where specific rules come into play, these are all increasing public perception of loot boxes and the public's awareness that these might be a rip-off, or they might be something slightly more sinister than a rip-off. When it comes to actually changing the market, really, really hard to work out what's going on. There are different things industry can do. So industry might note the potential for regulation and therefore make decisions about future monetization schemes that treat loot boxes as risky. So like, if you've got good reason to believe that these could be legislated to hell, maybe even declared a form of gambling, you've got a good reason to not sink tens of millions of dollars into putting them into your next product. So there's a really rational world in which industry moves backwards from loot boxes because of the threat of regulation, even if very little regulation actually occurs. What remains to be seen is whether this will actually happen, because it might be that loot boxes are just so ludicrously profitable that industry are going to roll the dice and take a chance of nothing happening. So in 3 years' time, we'll know what it did. And it's somewhere between massive reduction in loot boxes and absolutely nothing. It's too early to say.
And so, speaking about the market, what is your thought about the Asian market on loot boxes? Do you think that this industry may have some untapped potential that might help you unlock it, or the unanswered questions that you have about loot boxes? I saw in a CBC interview that you said that the really irritating thing is that I know there are middle managers at these companies, EA or someone like that, who have Excel spreadsheets on these companies that will help us answer these questions. Do you think that there may be some form of matter that the Asian market might have to help you answer these questions?
Yeah, so the Asian market is super, super, super interesting. So the Asian market's really interesting because of data. So there are regulations in place to do with data reporting, some of which are adhered to publicly. And that gives researchers a really interesting eye to loot boxes as a phenomenon. So for instance, there's this kind of document that was put out by a branch of the Chinese government that said, this is a lottery rule that relates to loot boxes. If you are running a loot box in your game, you have to disclose the odds and a proportion of the winners. And this announcement was taken very differently by lots of different games companies. So many of them published sort of static web pages that were like, here are 10 winners and here's what we say the odds are, go away. And then there were other companies who published very different, much more granular information. So in particular, Dota and CSGO, who are operated through a company called Perfect World in China, disclosed way more information. In the case of CSGO, they disclosed a constantly running tracker of the most recent loot box openings, including an identifier of who'd opened it. This is really interesting data for scientists, and it's the sort of thing that we've been asking to get access to in Western markets for a while, because you can find out loads of stuff just from that. So we've now run analyses over millions of openings in Chinese CSGO, and the most recent thing we found out is that loss chasing occurs within these openings, which if you're a loot box opener yourself, you'd say, yeah, of course it does, David. But this is stuff we're trying to evidence for governments and things. So the idea of loss chasing is you open more to make up for your losses. So say you are opening a loot box, you get something rubbish, you open a loot box, you get something rubbish, you open again, you open again and again and again, and then you've got something good, and then you stop. We've always proposed that loot boxes, if they were formally similar to gambling, might mirror gambling behaviors like this, and therefore might lead to similar outcomes to gambling. But we've never had any evidence of that because we've never had the data. But because this Chinese data is just public, we've used it to build a statistical model and show that this behavioral similarity does exist. So yeah, if the more of this data is available, the more we can find out.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it for the questions that I have. Dr. Zendle, is there anything that you would like to say to the audience? Anything you would like to shout out at this time?
I guess just that if you feel strongly about this issue, contact your local politician, right? So in the UK, I'd say contact your local MP. In the USA, I don't know who you contact. Maybe you contact a senator or something. But like, reach out to the people who have the power to change legislation, because they'll only hear that it's a problem if people make their voices loud. I guess that's it.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Thank you, Dr. Zendle, for being with us, and it's been a pleasure.
Awesome.